format for most of our weeks will be 3 hours in here, and we'll have a break at about 20 to 12 till 12. There's a 20-minute break in the middle, and follow that today. I'll talk about admin, course admin, later this morning. We're sort of a bit largish numbers for a seminar, but we'll have to do our best. I mean, this is Socratic, actually, in the sense that the course works with discussion amongst us all, rather than me lecturing. I mean, I usually make some preliminary remarks at the start of each session, as I will today, but we'll be discussing the texts. I mean, the course really depends on careful reading of the text. There's no point in coming if you haven't read the text. It would be a complete waste of time. So there's no point in coming unless you've read the text for the week carefully. The course is about culture, which is very difficult. I mean, our bodies depend on air to breathe, otherwise they die. All the other important parts of us depend on culture, and they die just as surely without it, or without significant culture. This course is a bit like the Nayaki Comanche last week. They say they're going that way, and in fact, they're going that way. It's very hard to get at the culture that matters, and so there isn't an obvious structure. I mean, there is a structure to the course. There's a sequence of weeks and stories and texts, but it won't be clear to you until late in the course the way we've headed and why, even if it's clear to you to you then. Culture's binding. I mean, it's the opposite of freedom. It's binding like Ethan's oath last week in the Searchers. I mean, he takes an oath without even knowing he's taking an oath. It's unconscious. It's not in the conscious mind. And it binds him. It governs what he then does in the most important episode in his life. It's an example of an oath. And sort of binding culture takes the form of an oath, even though literally you may not swear explicitly as one does in oaths normally. What we're going to be trying to get at in this course is, how this functions, how this comes about. We're going to be dealing with, there are three big questions that confront all humans. The metaphysical questions, which go something like, where do I come from? It's a sort of origin or creation question. All cultures attempt to answer this. What should I do with my life? Why am I here? What should I do with my life? It's sort of central meaning question. And finally, what happens to me at death? The death question. All cultures have to answer these three questions persuasively, otherwise they fall apart. And we saw examples last week of cultures that had fallen apart, both on the Indian side and on the white side. We're looking at the Greeks today, Socrates explicitly, and we'll be back with the Greeks in 2 weeks' time with Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, which is the central text in this course. Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy in German. I'll talk a bit more about that next week. It's very difficult. It's a very, very difficult text. It should be warned. It's not particularly long. It's probably about 100 pages that you'll be reading, but you'll be gnawing away at it, and it'll be gnawing away at you. The reading today, these two dialogues of Plato, they're much more accessible. A little bit about classical Greek culture, which is really the foundations of the West. We're in the context of Western culture, it's our culture. It comes down to us from a long time ago. Cultures are old things. And culture's not like science. Science progresses. New hypotheses, new discoveries often replace and make obsolete old discoveries and hypotheses in science. Culture doesn't work like that. It recurs. There are many things you'll find in Greek literature, classical Greek literature from 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, that are as profound statements about what it is to be human as anything subsequently. In a way, there's no progress in culture. There's just circling, retelling, recycling. Just a little bit on classical Greek culture. Again, we'll be coming back to it in 2 weeks' time. It really starts, to all intents and purposes, with Homer. And above all, Homer's work, the Iliad. About the Trojan War. Written probably about 700 BC, we don't know exactly. 2,700 years ago. If you've got time, and it'll be an important text in 2 weeks' time to read it. Translation with the Iliad is very important into English. I'd strongly recommend translation by Richmond Lattimore, American. The Iliad was, in effect, the Bible for classical Athens, for the great period, 5th century BC Athens. It doesn't read like a religious or a sacred text, but in effect it played the role of setting up the culture. Setting up the culture. Next important element in classical Greek culture was Greek tragedy. Again, we'll be very much focusing on this in 2 weeks' time. It's the most important ones: Sophocles, Oedipus. We all know about Oedipus. Oedipus the king. These are just examples. And Aeschylus. If you want to get a sense of Greek tragedy, read Agamemnon by Aeschylus. Translation is very important. Also, Richmond Lattimore translation. The translation of Oedipus doesn't matter as much. The Greeks also gave us philosophy. We're reading Plato today. Science, sort of sense of individualism, sculpture, drama. Most components of culture in that sense that we have in the modern West comes from the ancient Greeks, comes from the classical Greeks. The sense of the city, also city centering on beautiful buildings. Parthenon in Athens, still see it today. And many of our conceptions of things, this will become clear, we'll be talking a bit about this morning, sense of fate, destiny, sense of the power of reason and human intelligence, philosophising. Before we get into Socrates, a couple of Greek words I want to, this is words from the Greek itself. Greek word for beginning or foundation, arche, 421.
There's no spoon in there.
There's what?
There's nothing in there. Why would I?
John will be in there.
There's nobody in there.
Are you sure?
Yeah. There's just 2 other students down
Yeah,
there.
yeah. That's a builder.
Is there like a screen? Can we see the lecture at all?
There's the same classes being taken there.
So someone's giving a lecture.
Yeah. 421. Arche, as in we use it in archaeology, study of ancient artefacts, rocks, pots. Archaic, it's sort of old in the beginning. There is something in our culture, not just our culture, which somehow believes there are things back a long time ago that if we go in search of and we find them, or you're travelling to Europe, wherever it might be, there will be some great revelation, some mystery will be will be solved. And this is a sort of cultural impulse. Try and find out what was in the beginning. And the Christian Bible, Jewish Bible, starts with the Adam and Eve, the Genesis, in the Adam and Eve story in the Garden of Eden. It's a story about what was in the beginning. The Greeks had their own stories of what was in the beginning, but in effect, the big foundation story, beginning story, the arche story is the Iliad. It's about the hero. It sets up the story of the hero, Achilles, and the hero story has then come down to us in the West, really, from the Greeks. We retell the big stories. That's one of the big stories. The Searchers last week is really the Iliad in 1956. It's playing with the archetype. It's an important word for us in this course. The sort of blueprint or the sort of foundation, the core story, the in the beginning, the primary story. Second Greek word I wanted to introduce, the word for truth. Aletheia. It's classical Greek. Modern Greek has got some similarities to classical Greek, but it's somewhat different. This basically breaks down into a lethe. If we pull the word apart, lethe was the river running through the underworld. When you died, you crossed the river Lethe, the river of sometimes of forgetfulness, the vapours, the clouds rode over the river Lethe, make you forget.
Can I consult with you for 1 second?
Yeah, sure.
We've only got a couple.
Yeah, great.
Cheers.
I was just checking this space actually there. Is that okay?
Is that your preference?
Well, it's 20 past now.
Yeah, okay.
So there's no second.
Oh, right.
Which is,
So,
it seems a bit
yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah. I'm going to collapse it. There are only a few spill over.
The river Lethe, running through the underworld. Truth is then A in front of Lethe means not. It's a negation. Truth is not Lethe, not forgetfulness. Now, there's a whole sort of philosophy or idea then in just the word for the Greek word for truth, which we don't get in the English word truth. Lethe is also the forgetfulness, oblivion. There's a sort of implication is that we humans live in a state of oblivion or forgetfulness, not seeing. That's our normal condition. Oblivion, not seeing, blind. Truth is what wakes you up, or what you see when the mists over the river Lethe clear what you see. Now this is a loaded and rather powerful concept of truth. Truth is not oblivion or not forgetting. Plato himself believes in the soul, the immortal soul in humans, and he suggests that when the soul enters the human body, it forgets everything it knows, and it knows everything. So Plato sort of picks up this notion of aletheia and develops it into the sense that we humans are... Do you want to come here? One more coming here. So in that sense of belief of Plato's, we're born, the soul enters the body knowing everything, but at the moment it enters the human body, it forgets. There's oblivion, there's forgetfulness. Now, truth are those odd moments when you actually see through into what was known. In the 20th century psychologist Freud says the unconscious knows everything. There's probably similar view to Plato's. The unconscious knows everything. And we might, if you haven't shut those heaters off at the back, maybe please do it. They wrote that there are 3 that are on. Okay, that's a bit of background for Greek culture today, and in 2 weeks' time with Nietzsche. We're reading 2 dialogues of Plato today. Now, and let me reiterate, there's no point coming to this class if you haven't done the reading. Today's a partial exception, because I know some of you have come into the course in recent days, so I'm not going to enforce sort of a reading injunction. But we're going to be discussing the text. And the course is going to be a complete waste of time if you haven't done the reading. So, I can't stress this enough. And we've got such large numbers, it's going to be in everyone's interest that, those of you who are half-hearted or can't be bothered getting up on Monday morning, just sleep on. It's a blue. It's Alatea. This course is all about truth. Or it's an attempt at truth. All right, we've got 2 dialogues of Plato, who's really the foundation, the arche, the foundation philosopher in the West. Modern American philosophers said the whole of Western philosophy is just a series of footnotes to Plato. Plato's work is huge and very broad and expansive. We're looking at two dialogues, 2 short essays, I suppose they are, connected to the death of Socrates. They're written, we don't know when they were written, they're probably written about 10 years after Socrates' death. Socrates is a real person, Plato's a real person. Socrates, we know, died in 399 BC. He was killed by his fellow citizens on trumped-up charges, or maybe trumped-up charges. The general view is Socrates himself, as you know, thought the charges were unjust. So he was on trial, he was found guilty before his fellow citizens of Athens, and the sentence was death by poison, drinking hemlock, which he did. Socrates didn't leave any writings. We only really know about him through others, and particularly through Plato, but not only through Plato. I mean, if you take a dislike to Socrates or have doubts about him, there's a sort of satirical comedy by the playwright Aristophanes, actually quite funny, still readable today. Aristophanes, All the Clouds, where Socrates is the main character. He sort of satirises living in the clouds, just sort of spinning empty ideas, sort of frothy ideas. Clearly not Plato's view of Socrates. Socrates is the great hero for Plato. All right, we'll look at the Apology first, the longer of these 2. It's really, the title's a mistranslation. In Greek it's apologia, that really means defence. And this is sort of quite obvious reading it that this is Socrates' defence at his trial in Athens in 399 BC. And in it, he's defending his life and who he was. Who am I, Socrates? What did I stand for? In the terms of this course, what's my view of culture? And we're going to end up in our discussions here with 2 views, not incompatible views of culture. Socrates puts one. In 2 weeks' time, Nietzsche will be putting, severe critic of Socrates, will be putting the other. the Nietzsche view is much more that culture's based on stories, on great stories, on like the Iliad, whereas that's not Socrates' view. Well, for Socrates' view is pretty simple. I mean, it's nothing very complicated. It's not difficult. What is his? What's the good life for Socrates?
So the just life.
The just life, which means a bit more elaborate. What's the just life?
Well, I think Socrates liked to term the just life to be the best life he could know through reason.
And what does it influence? It influences your behaviour in what sort of way?
Well, if he could find the most logical way through reason to live, and that's the way he would, then if he was through discussions with others...
Logical is probably not the right word. Yeah?
Ethical?
The most ethical. The most... Another word for ethical?
Virtuous.
Virtuous. Moral. Virtuous. How does that translate into what you do? You get up in the morning, what you do during the day. It means that you act.
It's about fairness, isn't it? About how you treat others.
It's about treating others well, doing the right thing. Any other way of putting this?
Death before dishonour.
Yes, but the dishonour is a very specific. It's true for Achilles, death before dishonour. But for Achilles, dishonour is not to do with doing the good act, being a good person, basically. Socrates is talking about being a good person. Avoiding doing... The worst thing is to do harm to others, to do evil.
Isn't that expectation? Like knowing, which means that you are expected in the norm to act in certain ways, and that's how the law comes in, or the law comes in place, which people follow the laws, and the laws are the morals. And
You mean the laws of the state?
the laws of the state and the laws of the culture. Unwritten laws.
They're different things. They may... Socrates thinks that he's being judged unjustly by the laws of Athens, so they're not the same thing.
He himself says to listen to the expert opinion, not the popular opinion.
But he also seems to have just a disdain for people not thinking it through themselves.
Not examining their lives.
Yes. That ethical position actually comes from that examination.
So the good life is not only doing the right, the just thing, the good thing rather than the bad thing, but also thinking through, because it's often unclear what's the right thing as opposed to the wrong thing.
To achieve the truth. Thinking through in order to achieve
virtue.
Truth in the matter.
To achieve virtue, it's a moral, to be good.
Now, how does one decide what's virtuous and what isn't?
Through thinking, through examining the situation.
Okay.
Is he right? I mean, we all...
Who has the time?
Who has the time?
But that's his point, isn't it? I mean, that's why he's on trial. That's his defence, is that he's actually on trial for questioning people's motives and the reason that they're acting in particular ways. That they're just the sheep of their culture, rather than...
Saying I haven't got time.
Yes.
And he's willing to be a martyr, in that effort.
For his beliefs. Well, let's just come back to is he right? I mean, a lot of people say, don't they? I just want to be a good person. I mean, do we basically believe? Are we basically followers of Socrates today?
I think he's right.
It depends on what you mean by right, though, doesn't it?
Well, about his conception of the input. If we're born human beings, we're asking the question, what should I do with my life? Basically, what he's answering that question, what should I do with my life? Act virtuously, avoid doing harm to others, be a just person. So he's putting a whole philosophy of life on, I want to be a good person, to use maybe a modern phrase. Yeah?
I think the way that he
makes it so that there's a motive to living the just life. So, like, to him, the motive's important. Because you could, like, just live your whole life and inconsequentially not hurt anyone, but, like, if you don't have motive to actively not hurt anyone, then it's not necessarily the just life. You just happened to make it through life without hurting anyone.
Does he say that? Does Plato say that?
I think he does.
Yeah? Go on, what does he...
Life is the one not worth living.
The unexamined life.
Yeah. That's a crucial issue for...
So that it implies that you actually want to do good. So you have a motive to do good.
And more than that, his motive is never to stay alive as long as possible. Like you say, do we do that today?
Yeah.
It's probably because our motive is to preserve our life and protect ourselves above being honourable or being virtuous. Whereas for him, he's saying, look, I could... Oh, I'm jumping to the creature, sorry. But he could say, I can escape. But in doing so, I'll face judgment in the afterlife.
But I think one of the great things about Socrates, especially these two dialogues, is his almost complete ambivalence towards death. For Socrates, he's almost, well, at least in these two dialogues, he's completely consumed by what it is to live a good life. He doesn't. So, if we put it within the sort of schema of the three metaphysical questions, he doesn't really, in these two dialogues, he doesn't care where it comes from. He doesn't care where it goes. What's at issue and what guides him is, how do I live a good life now? And if I can't fulfill that, then I might as well die. But I'm ambivalent.
Ambivalent? Where's the ambivalence then? Where's the other side of that? It seems straightforward. I have to be a just person, living a good life, not doing harm to others. End of story. Where's the counter to that?
Well, I think the counter is simply the understanding that, like, he's in a context where he's in a court case where the consequence could be death, and he almost barely. His response to the idea that he could be put to death is saying, "Well, how about instead of killing me, you throw a banquet?" He has this sort of.
He says, "I'm not afraid of death."
Yeah, but he also says at one point that he doesn't know about what happens after death. He says it could just be a great sleep. We don't know.
Yes.
And later on, he changes his mind about that.
Does he? About what happens at death?
Towards the end of that there is an afterlife.
Where in these two dialogues? I don't think he says
Oh,
that.
no, he does with the voice of the law of Athens and the Creta. But it's through the voice of the law of Athens that he's being judged.
Wouldn't he want to die if he was a true philosopher and to truly understand and to set his soul free, like he said in Aletheia, to just kind of ultimately understand what comes after? Because in his mind, he's already accomplished what it is to live.
But he says he doesn't know. He says death might just be death. That's it. I mean, I don't know. I mean, he's probably the position of the most honest people today. I don't know what happens at death.
And that's what encapsulates all of his arguments is the wisest thing you can ever say is that I know nothing. And so it's ignorant for people to fear death, whether it's a black sleep or whether there is an afterlife. In either case, who are we to assume it's a bad thing?
So that's why the Delphic Oracle describes Socrates as the wisest man, because he admits that he's ignorant about the death question. I think that's a strong argument, isn't it? Because there is this strange thing that... Can you go to 421 and get a chair and bring it down?
Well, it's also not like he's like, oh, I'm guilty. I'd kill me. He tries to campaign. Oh, how about I pay a fine? He's trying to avoid death as much as he can, but he's not. Oh my God, please don't kill me. He's like, well, this is an alternate option.
He doesn't want his friends to pay a fine, though.
Well, but I think he says himself, doesn't. I'll pay. They're like, no, you have to pay more. And his friends offer, and then he's like, no, I can't get my friends to pay for me. Sure.
That's the kind of interesting point, right? So he first actually offers to, he goes, how about a fine that I can afford, which is like hardly anything.
Yeah.
But he's mocking.
But then when his friends say, no, we'll pay the fine, he says, well, they're going to pay up it, right? He's actually, I think, contrary maybe to what you're saying, he actually doesn't want to pay the fine. He wants to raise it so that no one can afford it. There's this weird thing, he makes it harder as soon as he finds out that the original fine he offered was going to be too easy.
I felt like there was some conflicting bits in his position, particularly in the apology. I felt like there was a real self-righteousness of his position that, sorry, I'm trying to think of the way to articulate my position, but
He is very self-righteous, you're right.
He is very self-righteous. And there was, I mean, later in the creature when his friend was talking about his sons and his responsibility to society, I felt like he wasn't examining those issues. He'd come to his position and you could understand how he had gotten there. But as a parent, I felt like there was some conflict in that position as well. He did have a lot more to offer his society, and that self-righteousness of the way he communicated his position obviously really just pissed people off, and that's why he was and maybe there was another way to communicate his wisdom that didn't rile people in the same way. It's difficult to tell. I mean, obviously, it was Plato's interpretation of Socrates as well. But, yeah.
Well, let's leave whether you personally like Socrates or not aside. We're really discussing his view of what it is to be human here. Is he right? Just back to the core question: is he right that this is the central thing for us humans is to lead a good life and not do harm to others? Full stop. If we take sort of popular television as a gauge, soap operas like Home and Away, they're all about, and this is a sociology class, and so this is sort of evidence for us, they're all about people doing the right thing as opposed to the wrong thing. I mean, your teenage daughter gets pregnant, parents, should you advise her to have an abortion, to get married, a difficult common situation today. Basically parents, what's the right thing to do? What's the right thing for us as parents to do, as opposed to the wrong thing?
I think we aim for it. We aim for good. But, even in the example of the pregnant teenager, is she doing harm unto herself, the fact that she's pregnant?
Well, she is pregnant. You've got a situation. You've got to deal with the situation.
Yes, but even to that point, your parenting style has affected those outcomes, and now you have choices, or in fact, they have choices to make, and they're at an age and a stage where you can guide them, but you can't necessarily tell them what to do.
That's part of your thinking. I can't interfere. She's 17.
Should she keep it? Is that better for humanity?
But you're doing exactly what Socrates says you should do. You should think through the various options in this situation so as to do the best as opposed to the worst, to be just.
And shows like that seem to simplify it because maybe there's no real wrong or right.
The stories simplify. Simplify. There's no reason criticising Home and Away. I mean, you watch Law and Order or any of the police shows or any of those. They're all about justice as opposed to injustice, aren't they?
And the whole point seems to be to come back to that self-examination. That's the important bit, to work out what's right.
But for Socrates, the important thing is actually the act at the end, to do the right thing. And the means is the self-examination.
When I think about it, I think the difference is, on an individual level, it's definitely easy for us to accept that, yes, we should always aspire to do the virtuous thing. But from a societal or greater cultural level, there are much bigger things to come into play, like maybe more of a consequentialist way of thinking about right and wrong is better. Like for a society, you've got to think about the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and in doing so, you might commit a wrong act for the majority, whereas Socrates, being an absolutist in this sense, would say absolutely no.
So your Prime Minister, there's a terrorist threat to the country, you have to send troops off to fight in Afghanistan. You know it's very likely that some of those troops are going to get killed, which is terrible, ill. But you have to make... Socrates might then say, well, the admirable Prime Minister actually thinks through all of that and weighs it up and thinks, well, on balance, this is terrible, but the alternative is even worse. So, I mean, I think Socrates can answer you in that sort of, very human situation.
I don't know if he ever says anywhere that the rules and regulations of doing right, choosing the right thing to do by others, is actually a protection for the community as a whole.
Does he link this back to protecting the wider community? What's the ultimate reason? What's the ultimate? It's an important question. What's the ultimate reason or justification for doing good. Why, if you follow this path, do you do it?
It's the welfare of the soul, isn't it?
The welfare of the soul. So it's individual. It's the psyche, the Greek word for soul.
So then the Prime Minister wouldn't be doing the just thing because maybe, they wouldn't be able to sleep at night. So
Because people have died because of their
Exactly.
decisions, yes. Well, the great Italian political philosopher says, Machiavelli, if you go into politics, you shouldn't be concerned about your own soul because you're going to have to make decisions. I mean, he's praising people who go into politics because it's a terrible thing to have to do. That you actually, if you're really focused on the state of your own soul, don't go into politics. Actually, Socrates himself says his inner voice told him not to go into public life. So, it might have been part. But that's a separate issue, the sort of the vocation of politics. Like Ethan last week does terrible things. I mean, and his soul is damaged probably by what he does, but from his perspective, he has to do it, otherwise he's not going to succeed. I mean, he's a sort of political person, the hero from last week. But you're absolutely right. I mean, if purity of soul and me and my soul is your consideration, don't go into politics. Then that's not a criticism of politics, because politics is necessary. It's a personal choice. The great sociologist Max Weber has a terrific essay, Politics as a Vocation, just precisely on this dilemma of anyone who goes into politics.
So, is the point of, I suppose, Socrates then, is the examination? Because from the parent example, you could still not be choosing the right thing, and then when you have hindsight, you realise that the alternative was best. But if you examined and you thought you had all of the variables that you were considering, then did you do the right thing because you did the best that you could with the information that you were given at that time?
I mean, ultimately, it's what you do that counts. But you might, at your account, you might do all the right reasoning and think you're doing the right thing, and actually, then it happens in retrospect. You think I did the wrong thing, but you did the. Socrates would probably say, "Well, you did the best you could, but you got it wrong. We make mistakes." Machiavelli, I'll put his name up because it's contrast. As John said, this is not. We're not being good for the sake of society. This is not a sort of social ethic. We're doing good for the sake of our own individual soul. Machiavelli, the counter view. For Machiavelli, the person who goes into politics, your duty is to the state, to your people, not to your own soul. So the ultimate end for Machiavelli, anyone who goes into politics, is the well-being of the whole. And coming back to your point, this is a bit of a problem for Socrates. I mean, how does he get from the state of the individual soul to the good of Athens?
They're irreconcilable, that's the problem.
They may be. There are times when they are.
I don't think Socrates admits that they're irreconcilable. I think there's conflict, obviously. But one of the points he makes is when he uses the voice of the law of Athens, and he seems to agree with it, is the idea that the city of Athens is what generates the man Socrates.
Yes.
He seems to think there's something, there is a relationship there that isn't always conflictual.
Yes,
there's
that's
something
true.
generative in culture.
I think I'd rather leave that till a bit later. We come to the Crito, because that's the central argument of the second dialogue, which, in a way, I mean, you're right. This sort of addresses this particular problem. I want to come back to, though, is this. I mean, what have been the most important things? If you examine your own lives, what have been your most important experiences? What have been the things that have made life worthwhile? And for a lot of people, it's romance, it's falling in love. It's a sort of drunken intoxication, inspiration. The soul becomes larger. You find the perfect person with whom you're in perfect harmony. That's got nothing to do with goodness.
And the complementary state to that is writing poetry, which is interesting because Socrates is he doubts the poets. They don't know what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. They're sort of beside themselves.
He's in competition with the poets.
Yeah, he is, yeah.
Because writing poetry is not virtuous. It's not necessarily doing good to anybody. Poets might think this is good for the state of my soul, but from Socrates' perspective it's not, because it's not to do with ethics and morality. It's not to do with goodness.
Having children teaches you to look after other people, even to the detriment of yourself.
That sounds fairly ethical though, isn't it? Isn't being a good person is...
It teaches you what it feels like, because it's a very, very strong emotion to look after somebody else, to look out for somebody else.
So the powerful emotion of being a mother or a father is not necessarily about being good or just. It's just that this is an extraordinarily powerful human experience and very important and central.
In the doing good area.
And well, a lot of it's got to do with doing good, but a lot of it's narcissistic, isn't it? That I enjoy it. This is a creation of mine. I identify with my children. I'm irrational, actually. If I had to think about what's the right thing to do, when it comes to them, I often won't do the right thing because I want to protect them or I want to give them advantages. So it is another. We've got romance, we've got motherhood and fatherhood. There are other examples of very important human experiences which don't fit Socrates. We're going to watching extraordinary performances in sport or ballet. I had a miserable afternoon yesterday going to the football and watching my team thrashed. That was an anti-aesthetic experience, but if it had been the other way around, the pleasures or inspirations, they would not have, Socrates couldn't have explained them. And they're not, for many people, they're not unimportant. There's a sort of aesthetic sublime or aesthetic, whatever language you want to use. A poet could catch this.
That whole, the whole essence of success, he denounces, especially relevantly to the time, about political title or military title or gaining money. He says, he denounces those people. So I guess that's something else, or career success in our lives is important.
Yes, but even more powerfully, as John says, he denounces poets because somehow poets corrupt us. He almost goes as far, doesn't he? Because they take our minds off virtue.
And they haven't been instructed by self-knowledge, that they possess some kind of intuition.
Inspiration.
Yes,
Genius
rather than rational self-examination. Very true. The poet.
Drunk philosophers.
Pardon?
I said they're like drunk philosophers.
Well, maybe they're like drunk. We're back with Alatea. They're blind, or they're in a they're drunk philosophers.
But that's part of his criticism of the poets too, was that he thought that they would have such wisdom because of what they wrote. But when he went and examined them individually, he found that they didn't actually assign that same meaning that he was getting from the poetry. Or at least that's what I read. So that was part of it. He thought that he was going to encounter some sort of wisdom, maybe about virtue and maybe about quality of life and meaning of life. But what he found was that there wasn't much substance to the person who had written this amazing poetry.
Yes. I mean, some of you will have grown up as Catholics, Roman Catholics, and may well still be. The sort of Catholic view of the human condition is be a good person, and if you're a virtuous person rather than a bad person, you'll get to heaven. You'll be rewarded religiously. There's a similar view to Socrates. Where are we? Socrates partly right, or yeah?
I think Socrates is, like you said, partly right. Aletheia maybe being this land of the pleasures, and in a way, the world we live in today, where we sort of go on what we like and what makes us feel good, and we sort of deny what makes us feel bad. But in a sense, I think that is living in a little bit of a state of oblivion. And perhaps it's not completely the other way that Socrates believed, but that's somewhere in between, this balance of the two, if that makes sense.
And a balance with the ethical? in the ethical world?
Not so much the ethical, but between this truth that Socrates believed. So just being virtuous and being good to others is the foundation and purpose for human life, and then to somehow, I suppose, prioritise where the pleasures and things come into it, and perhaps rather than living based on pleasures, perhaps live based on his ethic or his,
The poet's not. I think the poet's writing about some sort of other sort of truth, though, not moral truth. Some other sort. Well, Homer would be writing about some other form of truth. It's not just it's not just about pleasure. The contrasting view is not just about pleasure.
At one point, he very briefly points on if you live your life to be virtuous, then those other things are subordinate to that, and they'll come.
Yes.
Didn't you write about the human beings have a natural inborn instinct to seek out right and wrong? Is something you wrote?
I mean, I think that's true, that the sort of moral sense is innate, but it's a bit separate issue too. I mean, Socrates doesn't really ask the question, where do we get our sense of what is right and wrong? Is it given to us, or, we're often in situations where we're not quite sure what to do, where there are grey areas and we have to think, and we do.
It's about self-awareness as well. It's about telling us to be honest with ourselves and either seek out this just life or at least acknowledge that you're not, and not be in a sense of oblivion simply by accepting that you're not living the just life.
Self-knowledge is perhaps a part of it, but self-knowledge often comes with a sense of, I'll get some sort of fulfillment, or there'll be some sort of redemption in knowing myself. But Socrates is much more concrete. It's doing the right thing. There was a sort of war in Greek culture between Socrates, or we can see this now in Homer. And the Greeks had a lot of debate about character virtues. What's the virtuous person? For Socrates, in these dialogues, it's the just person. Whereas for Homer, one of the sort of ultimate value is almost balance, temperance, or the admirable person is in control of their passions.
I know this is a little off topic, but doesn't Socrates in the Gorgias talk about the mean? About how...
Yes, he does. I don't want to stray there because there are a number of different Socrates in Plato's dialogues. We're just looking at this Socrates. And this is the one that's been the very influential one in the Western tradition. But you're right. One of the slogans over the Delphic Oracle, the famous Delphic Oracle, was "Nothing in excess." Sort of. Oh, you always can. There are two. And the other is know thyself. So carved in stone over the entrance to the Delphic Oracle. Now, this is not Socrates' view. This is a sort of competing view of culture. That the admirable person is balanced, moderate, calm. Things are in harmony. As opposed to good.
Why is it opposing? Why is good opposing to that?
In the Iliad, the hero Achilles some of you saw the film Troy, Brad Pitt. It's based on the Iliad. Brad Pitt's terrible. He's terrible in that film. There's Achilles. Most implausible Achilles. But it does give you a sense of the culture, that film Troy. Achilles basically loses his temper because he gets into a rage because his best friend's been killed on the field of battle. And then he's refused to fight until this point, it's the Trojan War. His friend Patroclus is killed, and then in a rage of grief and anger he goes in, and he's so much better warrior than anyone else. He just runs amok on the field of battle, slaughters hundreds and hundreds of Trojans, including 15-year-olds pleading for their life. But the sort of sitting over him and what he's doing is, this is excessive. This is a man who's out of control, and he'll be punished for it. Achilles himself knows, it's one of the powerful things about him, he knows I shouldn't be doing this, but I don't care. My closest friend's been killed, and revenge, a bit like Ethan last week, revenge is more important than anything else, and I'll take the consequences. But the judgment over him is he lacks balance. This is excessive, and for that you'll be punished. There'll be some judgment. Now Achilles is not a good man. On the contrary, he's like Ethan last week. He's an extremely violent man. But the ultimate value in the Iliad is not goodness. It's excellence and balance. Excellence as well, being really good at what you're doing.
And transcending generations.
And transcending generations, and it's told through beautiful poetry. And the Iliad is extraordinary. That's why it's important in English to read that translation. And there's a sort of almost rhapsody or redemption in the actual language of the Iliad. And again, it's got nothing to do with good or bad. I mean, it's one of the things that poetry does when it's great. It takes us above, like great performance in sport or in ballet. It takes us out of ourselves and inspires us, elevates us.
Wouldn't Socrates argue that if somebody just tries to be balanced, they're kind of going with the flow and just doing what's expected of them instead of throwing themselves into doing something that's good? I mean...
He might. The Greek tragedy is full of examples of trying to find some sort of equanimity. When terrible things happen in your life, trying to find some sort of poise or balance or equanimity or serenity. There's probably quite a bit in our culture today that would agree with this view too, that tragedy strikes, someone close to you is killed or dies, or something terrible is done, a violation last week in the searches. How do you find, how does your soul find some sort of peace, some equanimity, some balance? That's the real test in the human condition, not whether you're a good or a bad person. It's different. It may be not incompatible, but it's different.
So is that why Socrates isn't balanced? Because he's stuck on the question of origin rather than all through metaphysical in the afterlife?
So Socrates is not balanced, so you come to judgment.
No, I don't mean to judge.
Nietzsche in 2 weeks' time will like you. He thinks he's unbalanced.
Like he's a real idealist, and you need people like that to help inspire you to go that way. But in the real day-to-day experience, sometimes it's about less harm rather than more harm, not...
Well, he would agree with that. Minimise the harm. That's the Socrates view.
Yeah.
You're going to minimise the harm.
What we just said then is something I thought that was really interesting about this reading compared with the movie last week, which is both the characters Ethan and Socrates are sort of working towards the betterment of society, but aren't being accepted by the society in so doing. But also they're opposites in that in Athens that it's all about revenge or retaliation against him. Whereas with Ethan, he was the one all about revenge, while the society was trying to take the more of a moral ground, whereas Socrates is the one trying to be more moral. But also both of them are the product of an earlier time as well. So that, I thought that was a very interesting...
Socrates is trying to help the wider society, is he?
He sort of is. He wants Athens to be a better place. He wants human society to be better. If people act more virtuously, yeah, it would be better.
Yeah, because in Athens then it was all about the more Iliad-like life, whereby you're trying to be excellent and be tough, and that's what he was questioning at the time, wasn't it?
That's more complicated, the history. They've just lost a war to Sparta, which they should never have lost, 30-year war, and so the society is demoralised. And it's a bit like the French at the start of the Second World War, sort of demoralised society. So they're just in public, they're behaving badly. I don't think it's no great idealism about Homer and Achilles that's driving the citizens. It's just resentment against Socrates.
Because he was right.
What about the stinging fly business? You know, he says, my vocation was to come into Athens and a bit like a horse fly, that stings, to wake you up. We're back to our tea, to wake you up, just to confront yourselves with who you are. Without me, you're going to just sleep on. And you know, it's partly why he's so hated at this point in time. The role of, I mean, philosophers don't do this today, maybe they should. Walk around and sticking pins, prodding, you know, what are you doing? I mean, journalists try to do this to some
Spanish
people.
have a saying, part of their national character is in a dialogue with someone, they stick pins into each other. A pin is a chincheta. And so they call someone, oh, you're very chinche. You're sticking pins into people. They do it all the time.
Is this, I mean, it's often said in friendship, one of the characteristics of friendship is you can tell your friend the truth. In other words, you could be Socrates, the nasty truth or the uncomfortable truth. That's right, isn't it? So do we need... Socrates, in a way, is saying to all of us, be me, be philosophers, examine your lives, act virtuously, and go around sticking pins, pricking those around you about what they're doing. Yes or no? Everyone will get really fed up with you as a busybody, mind your own business.
Something you have to get used to. After that, you can accept it. But for an Anglo to suddenly find him or herself in that environment, it's very unnerving. So I guess that's a cultural thing as well.
But in other societies, unless someone's a friend, you don't walk around telling them your opinion of them and what they're doing, do you? Normally, it's none of your, say it's none of your business. Yeah.
I don't think that sticking pins into people is necessarily correct. I think that that part of Socrates I probably disagree with, for the simple fact that it's based on subjective judgment about what someone's doing that you believe is incorrect, but not perhaps, I don't know, incorrect as in there's this one truth going through society, there's this one correct way. I think it's a subjective judgment, so no, I wouldn't agree with that.
But isn't that
Socrates all about arguing?
Socrates does?
Exactly. Yeah. By telling that person something that you might judge, then they might give their side, and then you can actually examine the situation more appropriately. Because if you never tell them, then you can never know their side.
We value a free press, and the free press at its best exposes corruptions and injustices, whether in newspapers, television, radio. Very important part of our society, and it's actually doing the stinging fly business.
But it's completely subjective. I don't know if it's meant to be related to anything.
Well, Socrates would disagree, and he would say, well, it's not, because if you have a public discussion about what's the right and wrong thing to do, you'll be arguing, well, this is the virtuous thing, and in order, in response to my pregnant daughter, goes through an argument, and then someone will say, well, that argument's convincing, or it's half convincing, or it's not convincing. We have a discussion in order to reach a common agreement about what's the right or wrong thing to do. And usually amongst humans, there is a sort of consensus in this situation.
It's not like Socrates is going around just telling people one version. He will go through each premise and gain their acceptance from each of the premises before he then says, well, you've agreed to these, so here is the conclusion. You surely can't deny the conclusion now after we've gone through each premise that you've agreed to, like in the Creto. Yeah. So, and that's why people hate him so much, because they embarrass him. So he embarrasses them.
Yeah. It'd be great to see a bit more of that in politics. In that culture.
Well, politics is more examined than anything else in our society. There's so much.
But there's not much of there's not much of an opportunity to really participate in that debate in the current.
Well, I mean, but it's funny because this is, in a sense, somewhat what our parliamentary system is set up on. Like, we have an opposition, and that's their job. You know, in a sort of the system we've got set up, the opposition's job is to keep pushing back at the party in power and saying, that's wrong, that's a contradiction, that's wrong, this is why. Maybe they're doing a bad job at that, but our parliamentary system is sort of an inheritor of this sort of Socratic way of thinking.
What about the examining bit? I mean, there are very virtuous people or good people who actually are not very reflective. Sort of literature's full of saints or, you know, simple good people who actually are not. Yes, they sort of don't really fit Socrates' argument, or maybe Socrates' argument has. Is that plausible or not, or is this just a sort of an illusion that there are such people?
Maybe they're just not articulating that examination. They're not very good at it, but there's still a level of examination.
Well, what those people, the life of those people that I'm thinking of would imply is that goodness is intuitive. You're sort of in your bones, you know what's the right thing and you know what's the wrong thing. Now, if that's true, you don't need to examine it too much, do you?
But then it's not examining, and that's like the poets, using their intuition rather than actually
Yep,
trying to get
it
both
is.
sides.
Yes, and then acting on
Intuition.
yes. And psychopaths are precisely people that we describe as don't have that natural intuition about, or natural conscience about doing harm. They can do harm with a good conscience. The implication of that terminology is that for most humans, there is a sort of innate sense of right and wrong, certainly in powerful cases.
There'll be lots of arguments that that's just cultivated by the culture that they live in, though, that that's conditioning.
Yeah, amongst certain branches of sociology, but probably not much beyond that.
Yeah.
I mean, human cultures share the basic moral laws of, you know, thou shalt not kill and so forth.
But those are also really good things for just a group of people to have. So you teach it to the next generation not to go and kill random people because you want to have order in society. So you can make that argument that it's not so much you believe it's good, it's just that it's the best way to run things.
Yeah, we'll come to that. Let's come to that discussion in a couple of weeks' time about whether this is all taught or whether it's innate or both, or that's less an issue for today. What about Socrates' vocation as philosopher? His view is he was called. You know, this is being a philosopher was God spoke to him, or his inner voice spoke to him about being a philosopher. I couldn't be anything else because I was born, basically, or fated. This is not something I've chosen.
I guess that's part of the contradiction with him, isn't it? That he is contending that if you examine yourself, you can come to the right conclusion, but he seems to be in possession of this absolute truth that he is fated almost to be possessed of this sort of absolute truth by this sort of inspiration and this voice, and his duty, his sense of duty to lead a philosophical life.
And he'd be betraying this if he didn't accept the judgment of Athens.
Mm.
Wasn't it the oracle who said that Socrates was the most wisest man in Athens? And that led him to the conclusion that the wisest man is the one who knows nothing at all.
No, I don't think that's quite accurate. I don't know, because he seems to interpret it weirdly. Well, at least in the Apology, he seems to interpret it, whether he's just putting this on for the jurors, I don't know, but he seems to interpret it as saying that what the Delphic oracle meant was not that he was the wisest because he knew nothing, but rather that all human wisdom was vanity. That seems to be how he interprets it in the Apology.
Or that he acknowledged that he was ignorant.
Yeah, but the whole point was that the wisdom wasn't so much something particular about himself, but something about the vanity of all human wisdom.
And yet he spends his whole defence saying that I know that the good life is being just. That's that's sort of a central contradiction. The one important thing that he is ignorant about and confesses is what happens at death. I think that's the one substantive component of, what singles him out from a lot of people.
And I think that point leads to what you were saying about we don't really know, and it is contradictive when he says about the oracle, because he then goes to say we don't know if it is just a dreamless sleep or whether there is an afterlife, and that's almost him hinting at. I think he's talking about the oracle to try to defend himself against the impiety, because he doesn't really believe. If he really believed in the gods, he wouldn't say we don't know what it is. He would say there's an afterlife.
Yeah, that's true.
I think that's only just so he doesn't get put to death not believing in gods.
And he's so self-righteous, it's hard to think that he believes that he doesn't know anything.
Exactly.
So you're reading as this is just a trick for the jury,
At
which
least
fails.
The thing about the gods, just that part, yeah.
And the vocation, is that the bit that you mean too, where he was talking about how he was called to it, and he did reference the gods in that as well, and it was difficult to really believe that he felt like the vocation came from a metaphysical sense so much as...
Except he does talk here, and he does elsewhere, about his inner voice. I think there's no question that Socrates does believe in metaphysical things, like his inner voice. I mean, it's often just called, it is here in places, his daimon.
And is the inner voice that intuition that you're...
Well, he basically says it's this demon, this daimon, who speaks to me whenever I was about to do anything wrong. And also basically advised me not to go into public life. And if he's got, the Catholic tradition is the guardian angel, Socrates, daimon. The word demon in English is too moralised, doesn't really fit the Greek sense of a daimon is a sort of demigod or half-god.
Spirit?
Spirit, yeah, sort of spirit, yes. Like a guardian angel. Well, Socrates certainly believed very strongly that this sort of inner voice would speak to him because he was about to do something foolish.
But the inner voice sort of sounds like the voice of rationality, like don't go into politics.
No, it's not reasoned. No, I think the way he talks about it, it's not that.
Yeah.
No.
So if Socrates believes in the immortal soul and things like his vocation and his innate understanding of justice, those things are what he links to the immortal soul, the things that his soul knew before he was born, before they were attached to his body. And then the reason has to be applied to sort of always chase back to that immortal knowledge that he senses is innate within him, and that you have, within your life, you apply the reason to try to regain that immortal state. Which is why, as well, he faces death with so much courage, because I guess before life and after life, for him, he sees as the base of all truths or...
If you piece the different Socrates together that way, that's true, but the Socrates here in this doesn't talk about the soul knowing everything before. He doesn't talk about the soul in those terms. And he's, in relation to death, we should take him at his word here, he's agnostic in almost in the modern sense, that I just don't know. Maybe death is death, maybe the soul survives and I go off to Hades and I can examine the hero. I'd love to spend eternity examining, Achilles and Homer and whoever else. It'd be absolute pain in the neck because you can peaceful eternity wherever, and Socrates turns up.
He doesn't have a good comment about that, where he says, I'll go and pester them, but the good thing about there is they can't put me to death because I'm already immortal.
But this notion of vocation, this is the thing that's a bit back last week to Ethan's oath, that something has spoken to Socrates and said, Socrates, thou shalt be a philosopher. That is you. And by implication here he's saying it's for all of us. Thou shalt be philosophers and thou shalt examine your lives and try and be as good a person as possible.
That reminds me of one thing I highlighted about that. The thing for me that they have both in common the most, I think, those two characters, is do not think more of your children or of your own life or anything else than you think of what is just. And the two of them disagree on what is just, but both, they'll put that above anything else.
Yep. Okay, what response to that? What is just above absolutely everything else? Who are modern heroes? Do we sociology is often, if you look around in our society, who are heroes and who are villains? Do we judge them in terms of good, or do we judge them in other terms, or it's complicated? Who are
Doctors are heroes.
Doctors are heroes?
Sports people.
Blood?
That
Who?
doesn't fit very well into it, but in our culture, sports people who play sports.
Yeah, well, all right, doctors would be ethical, wouldn't it? They do good by, say helping people and doing good works. Sports people don't. It's aesthetic. Got nothing to do with virtue. What about other heroes or villains?
Nurses, and they don't get paid nearly.
Right, so that's
well
Socrates. They do good.
Yeah.
Julian Assange.
Julian Assange.
That's true though, isn't it? Like Bradley Manning and all that, those people at the moment, they are being hailed as
Who?
heroes. It's Bradley Manning, isn't it?
Among some sectors of society, that's not. I'm looking more for sort of more universal than that. Scientists? Because
just like contributions to science and stuff. Like
so they're helping to make a better world.
Yeah.
But a better world in terms of would be more ethical people, or would be more comfortable?
Probably more comfortable.
More comfortable. So that's not good. That's not to do with justice.
Peacekeepers.
Peacekeepers. That's to do with justice. That's Socratic. What about individuals who are
Like Mother Teresa.
Mother Teresa? Socrates. She does good. Socrates.
Diana.
Princess Diana. What about Princess Diana? She did a lot of good works. It's part of her story, but a lot of her story is to do with Cinderella, royalty, tragedy, mental illness, flawed character, lack of balance, or maybe coming into balance. We might have both cultures in the example of Princess Diana.
Gandhi.
Pardon?
Gandhi.
Gandhi. Is he a Socrates? Probably, isn't he? Yeah?
I think
Pure Socrates?
Yeah.
John's written on Gandhi.
Are you looking for heroes that are also kind of doing bad? There's like
Or
you're
villains.
looking for one on either side.
Well, if a villain's only to do with doing evil, or are the villains for other reasons?
Well, I mean, Australia has a great example in Ned Kelly.
He's ambivalent.
Yeah, in the sense that, Ned Kelly is often heralded as this sort of dominant figure in Australian culture, and yet, he was a thief,
And a murderer.
He didn't give to the poor.
No.
Well, he was
He
a
did
poor.
take from the
People laugh at this, but I was thinking Batman.
As a hero or a villain?
Well, as a hero, but a hero that, this is a bit lame and whatever, but, if you think of the end of the second last one, he takes on the
You
blame.
mean the Dark Knight?
Yeah. He says, just say that I'm the one who did these murders for the sake of the community. He's the
Because-
hero, but
yeah. Because the other guy, he doesn't want to bring havoc to
The
society
Joker.
by being honest about what happened.
Exactly.
But this is the Dark Knight's, I think, a very interesting film. Most of you probably have seen it, because you do have this Socratic hero, Batman, on one hand, and you've got this extraordinarily powerful figure of the Joker. But the Joker wins, doesn't he? The Joker represents something that the ethical is not strong enough to deal with. Everything's paralysed in front of the Joker, which, the ancient Greeks and Nietzsche in 2 weeks' time would agree with this, that the ethical is not strong enough for real culture. This was true last week. The ethical is not strong enough. Marty is the ethical one. It's not strong enough for real culture. So Socrates may apply in lots of things 90% of our lives, but beware in this territory. And Dark Knight is very powerful questioning I think you could read Dark Knight, it'd be a good essay for this course, questioning of Socrates, the Socrates position.
Is perhaps being ethical today seen as being weak as well? And you know.
Well, in Batman, there's a little bit of that in Batman, but generally not, is it?
That's a very isolated position.
Being good.
Being constantly ethical, yeah.
Like look at asylum seeker policy in Australia. Doing things right means people are scared that it will weaken our country and the ethical priority is lessened.
And people are motivated by just their own desires to not share what we have, whether or not you agree with that or not.
Well, let's try and think of individuals who are good and who are acknowledged as such in public. Is there a certain weakness associated with them or not?
They don't generally...
Mother Teresa was not seen as weak. Sorry?
Not generally in a position of power to influence, of course.
Well, political power is a separate issue. I mean, that's... there's, culture... Politics usually doesn't contribute much to culture, the sort of issues we're raising, but hero figures and villain figures do. I mean, politics is a separate domain, largely, which has its own rules and its own logic and goes its own way.
I think there are very few heroes that we can recognize individually because that's the problem with them, that people don't tend to, outwardly recognize them. They'll know that they do good and they'll probably say thank you on an individual level, but they're not well popularized until, I don't know, a certain point.
I think they become popular when they start helping others, because it's one thing to do good and sort of in a circle, but and we talked about sort of taking the blame or doing what you have to in order for the greater good.
Yep.
Someone like Nelson Mandela is a great example where we might all be selfish in that we want to prolong his life for as long as possible, even knowing that he is not of a capacity to improve the life of anyone else now. Just what he upholds or what he's seen to uphold, we all want him to remain longer because he portrays that hero.
And that's linked to goodness, isn't it?
It is, but if he got himself out of jail and that's all he did,
no, you wouldn't.
Did anyone know his name?
No. And Abraham Lincoln's become a hero with his presidency being linked to the liberation of the blacks, the end of slavery. So it's actually, Lincoln wasn't popular when he was assassinated, and for quite a long time afterwards in the United States. He wasn't a hero. But I think your argument would fit him actually very well. It's with the later association of Lincoln with the end of slavery, an ethical achievement.
But then again, doesn't that mean if he was a hero to a certain group, there's another opposing group? So the definition of hero can change between
depending on standpoint.
Yeah.
Yes, but Lincoln sort of got to the position in the United States where, for the vast majority, is a figure of consensus. Sort of.
Yeah, but I'm saying in general, any hero, it doesn't have to be Lincoln, but it could be another person where they could have helped a particular group of individuals, but at the same time, there's another opposing group that didn't want them because they saw him as a threat rather than something.
Yeah, it's contested.
Which is kind of Nietzsche's point that just because something may seem inherently good isn't strong enough. It has to win the culture war. It has to win the power struggle.
Yeah, and it has to be powerful enough to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, one of our central questions for the rest of this course is, what does that involve? We had that last week with Ethan, the standpoint that Ethan represented. To win that war, it was him, not the ethical, or the more ethical figure who was necessary.
Socrates highlights that himself in the Apology when he tells the story about the 30 tyrants, and he says, any time that any person stands up against the government and what they want to do for the sake of right, surely they'll die. Because it's unpopular even if it's right.
Yeah.
And we've seen that time and time again throughout history since then too.
Another question with the searchers. When Ethan shoots out the eyes of the dead Indian, is that a moral crime or is it something else? He's defiling the dead. Is that a Socrates crime, or is there more? Is it a sort of religious crime as well? Defiling the dead? Is he...
He's sort of transgressing a metaphysical attitude that the Indians have.
Yeah, and he's transgressing within his community, respect the dead, you know, whatever they've done. Don't defile a corpse.
He transgresses Homer's notion of balance, because it's not simply a matter of revenge. It goes beyond that.
Yeah. He transgresses the sense of self-control and of revenge. He also, but the "thou shalt respect the dead" is a sort of, I think, as you say, it's a metaphysical law, isn't it, rather than a good bad law. There's something more going on here than just the ethical.
It's motivated by fear too, that people don't really understand what happens when people die, so they don't want to play with that.
Yes, but it's playing with the sacred, isn't it? It's a transgression of the sacred rather than a transgression of a moral law. Now, if that's true in that important episode in The Searchers, it's not just good and evil or good and bad that's at stake. There's sacred and profane is at stake here. Metaphysical of the religious or the sacred. Yes? That's a problem for Socrates.
But it's something I think Socrates is connected to, because he's connected to the fates through his vocation as philosopher, and the fates stand above and beyond the gods themselves.
But he doesn't acknowledge in his advice to us that act so as to take account of the religious. He basically says in his advice to us, act to do the right thing as opposed to the wrong thing. And there's a moral law that you should be able to discover and then follow it. I mean, if you're going to text, we don't actually... Excuse me? All right, where are we then with the defence at the trial?
I think if we're talking about vocation, with relation to what Socrates is doing, seems to largely be attempting to define the role of the philosopher, what philosophy does, because there's that question, like, what is it exactly that you do?
Yes.
And, you know, and if it is largely about action, in that sense, he attempts to offer what the virtues of the philosopher are meant to be. So I think in relation, I mean, obviously in relation to his thought about justice, he sort of describes in the Credo why he must go to death, but it's also on the part of defining how faithful one can be as a philosopher as well. And he sort of offers virtues as what the philosopher does. He says in the Apology, in defending himself, he says, I offer my poverty as witness that I'm telling you the truth. So he's sort of at once saying that the virtue of the philosopher must remain within a sort of a sense of poverty and within the realm of truth as well, offering these as sort of accounts
not doing it for money
of his vocation.
We tend to believe in, I think you're right, we tend to believe, just extending that, we tend to believe in vocation today, don't we? The good life is sort of finding what I'm meant to do, what I'm meant to do in life. Socrates, in a way, is sort of playing on that. That may be true, but at the same time, being human means that you have a vocation to be a just person and a good person. It's part of your calling. He also says no harm can come to the good person. Now, is this plausible or not? He's about to be put to death, probably unjustly. Harm's coming to him. What can he possibly mean? No harm can...
Isn't it the harm to the soul, like what we're talking about?
One reading, so that your soul will be unharmed. Your body might be tortured, and you might suffer excruciating pain, and you might be killed, aged 18, not 70. I'm 70, but 18.
The peace of knowing that there's peace that comes
So that's the way to interpret this. There's a sort of sense of self-fulfillment or peace, or I did the right thing, even though I'm put in jail, I'm persecuted, Nelson Mandela.
And there'll never be a contravention of his will. So you can, as long as I maintain, what I've committed in my life, whether I live or die, my legacy remains. You won't change my stance.
Well, that might be a sort of admirable position that would be very hard for most people to live up to, wouldn't it?
Is there an element of excellence as well?
Excellence?
Like we talked about in the Iliad, how your ultimate aim is to transcend. Is there an element of that as well in Socrates? Because
yes,
if he flees, he won't. Everything he's taught so far will be gone. But if he dies,
yes. He'll be humiliated, and his whole life will be, in a sense, a joke if he doesn't, if he flees, or if he suddenly goes for self-preservation. I don't want life's. I mean, to a large degree today, don't we? Our culture says basically the important thing is to stay alive, irrespective of anything else. We'll get doctors to prolong and prolong and prolong that life, irrespective of how we live. It's a profound view, isn't it? And as it is, to some degree in all human societies. Selfishness, pleasure and selfishness, and we're all a major part of our motivation.
But don't we also see these achievements of, say, people like Lincoln as excellent? If you've managed to get rid of the slave trade, isn't that amazing? And don't you want to preserve that?
Would you want to be Lincoln, including being assassinated?
Well, I can't choose to be him.
No, you can't. But that's a cop-out.
If we're reading this within the text itself, Socrates does say, anyone who's really fighting for justice must live as a private citizen, not as a public figure if he's going to survive even a short time. So the idea seems to be that if you are a good individual in relation to what he's saying, that you must do it privately. It cannot be as a public figure, otherwise you can't survive.
I think it's a warning. I think it's to say that if you are to take this seriously, and if you are to take this into the public realm as I have, you will die. And so that there is something about the vocation of philosopher that where you find a meaning that overrides even your own life. There's something like maybe not exactly a Freudian death drive, but there's something more meaningful than even your own life.
Well, he believes in something higher than himself, doesn't he? I mean, this has been crucial through this course. Ethan takes an oath to something bigger than himself, and his self-respect requires him to stick on that path, and at the end right away, although he's on his own, he's got nowhere to go, his life's over. It's terrible self-punishment, but it's all in obedience of this something bigger, something beyond.
I think the private life thing can be maintained, though, even in respect to Lincoln, because a lot of people in academia point out that the Emancipation Proclamation was a war act, and it was only done in order to further the Union's position, and it wasn't actually something that Lincoln personally believed in.
That then brings us to the separate what's rationally true as opposed to the myth. The myth of Lincoln is that he ended slavery, and he's admired for the powerful ethical achievement of doing that, whatever the actual truth was. That's true. But in this course and in real culture, we're always going to be caught up in the stories rather than what actually happened. I mean, even if we usually don't know, except in a very rough sense, what actually happened.
And is that part of his warning of the public of doing good in your private life rather than aspiring to do good in the public life? Is that you can glorify those people who have apparently done something amazing, but that may not be all their story. And so then you're motivated by that excellence, but more public acknowledgement, I guess.
Is there enough motivation, though? I mean, the Christian tradition, particularly, and it's Catholic, basically says your motivation for doing good in Socrates' manner is God sees, and at death you will be rewarded. So there will be an answer. There will be a positive answer to the death question. You will go to heaven. Whereas Socrates is not operating, and most of us today are not operating in that world where there's some sort of God or something out there basically saying, oh yes, you have led a good life, even though only 3 other people know that. So there's a big question of motivation coming in here. That there's a reason that the Christian churches and other religions all do this, in that it's to strengthen the motive for being a good person.
Yeah, but then if there's nothing you believe in, like if you just think that you're, stooping for yourself, for your soul, a good thing, doesn't that mean that if you do get public recognition for something that you have done and you take that as like, I want to do this so that everyone can see me as doing something good, you're technically not doing a good thing?
Yes, no, you're not. You're doing it for pleasure. You're doing it for the pleasure of being acknowledged publicly. If you don't believe in something beyond, then you may as well just eat, drink and be merry.
Yeah, but
There's
does Socrates really believe in anything though, other than... That's another question, right?
He has no other reward.
He's charged with not believing in the gods. And maybe there's a plausible case against him. He's charged with corrupting the youth, and maybe there's a plausible case against him. Plato basically categorically no, this is completely unjust. If you read Aristophanes on Socrates, you'd say probably there is a case against corrupting the youth of Socrates. He's creating a generation which is too smart for its own good, wastes all its time philosophising with sort of empty ideas, instead of doing practical, useful things.
And here we are still talking about that.
Here we are. Well, Aristophanes would say we're just caught up in this Socratic sort of mystification and delusion, and basically say to us, haven't you got something better to do with your time?
Isn't that one of the reasons why he's so dangerous to the state? If he corrupts the youth that way, they can't recreate the way it has been before, in a sense.
It may be, although, the truth is, the problem for the Athenian state was it's just lost a war, and it's got a very poor leader, it's got a very poor political elite at this time. And what happens to Socrates is a symptom of weakness for other reasons.
Yeah, and also the other thing is that Socrates, one of the sort of things running through it is his fidelity to sort of the original Athens. One of the things
he believes in Athens.
Yeah, is that he holds up he upholds the constitution. He he follows the law.
He fights for Athens,
exactly,
and he's courageous in battle. The only time he ever leaves Athens, as far as we know, is as a warrior to go off and fight for Athens. So he's not just a philosopher. He's a good citizen in the sense of courageous.
I think that's a really good connection to talking about the private versus the political or public sphere, is that he believes in the constitution of Athens, but throughout the entire trial he's pointing out that the people that are operating in that sphere are corrupt, and he doesn't want to enter into that sphere because in so doing he'll either be killed by speaking his mind or play a game that he doesn't want to play. So in order to speak his mind and share with people what he knows, he has to do it on a one-on-one basis, or he'll be executed or assassinated before long.
Okay, let's have a 20-minute break. We'll reconvene at 12 o'clock. Anyone who feels that this is way too large a group to be comfortable, there's a retreat every Wednesday starting next week in my room. The reading itself, well, next week's Hamlet, I'll talk in a minute about what we're doing next week. The week after that's Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. You'll need a copy of it. It's in the bookshop. You can find it online. Written in German. The translation, which there are a number of half a dozen translations, 4 or 5, 6 translations. It doesn't matter hugely which one you use. They've all got strengths and weaknesses. So that's in 2 weeks' time. As I keep warning you, very difficult text. The week after that, King James Bible, or preferably the Bible, New Testament, 3 readings from it, preferably the authorised King James, but not absolutely essential. You've got to find a Bible somewhere or other. The week after that we're doing initiation, 2 readings from Anthropology of Australian Aborigine Initiations and Hindu Story of Kalavya. Both of those will be on, in fact are on LMS. They're available on LMS, both texts. Then a couple of weeks without readings because you've got short essays being set. Joseph Conrad, you'll also need it. Heart of Darkness, many of you will know it. It's a novella, 100 pages, 120 pages, written in English, so no translation problem. Readily, it's in the bookshop, readily available. You can also, if you want to read something that long online, but you probably need your own copy. It's in a pretty cheap Penguin. Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, week 9. We'll return to Birth of Tragedy, week 10, and the final reading, Herman Melville's also long short story, Billy Budd, which you'll also need to. It's online, and these are all classics which are very easy to get hold of. You can buy it in Penguin. This is a course for reading and rereading, probably not too much reliance on those of you who are English students, not too much reliance on secondary material. It won't help you very much. This course is rather about thinking and reading carefully and then rereading. Which brings me to Hamlet next week, the play, not one of the 20 or 30 films that have been made. Film seems to be made every 5 years of Hamlet. Usually do pretty well. 400-year-old play, Shakespeare. It's in the bookshop. Might be in English rather than sociology. If you're buying a copy, obviously online. The question for next week is what's going on in this play. It's been influential ever since it first appears. It's the most common agreement, most influential play in Western culture. Hugely written on. My doctoral supervisor a few decades ago said basically something's published on Hamlet every 10 minutes somewhere in the world. In Japanese or China, more Chinese now, it would have been Japanese then. How come? It's not an easy play. If those of you who are familiar with it will know. It's not one of Shakespeare's best structured plays. I mean, almost all critics would say it's the central work in Shakespeare's. The greatest of the sort of literary geniuses in Western culture, not just in English, Shakespeare. It's a central work that he produced. Structurally, it's not even a particularly good play. Freud, arguably the most influential theorist of the 20th century, the Oedipus complex, which he almost called the Hamlet complex, was at the centre of his work. Profound influence on Freud. Our question is, what's this story really about? It's the archetype question. I mean, how come it's 400 years old? It's about Elizabethan monarchy. It's difficult to read. It's long-winded. It's structurally not very sound. Something must really be going on in this play. It must hit a nerve. It must hit it must be getting onto something that's of central importance to us humans. What is it? That's the Hamlet question.
I mean, it covers almost every theme that anybody has ever called into question.
Maybe that's a discussion for next week. What it does deal with, or someone you might think, well, actually, it's pretty narrow. It doesn't deal with very much at all. It deals with everything. Pretty narrow. And how come films kept being made and they're successful? Not just the Mel Gibsons. They're successful. It's a very. Shakespeare had a working vocabulary of 30,000 words. Your standard television show has a working vocabulary of 300 words. And yet films of Hamlet, which is very, very wordy, keep doing well at the box office. It's not just amongst English department literary critics that there's interest in Hamlet. Well, there's probably less in English departments these days. Sociology departments interested in Hamlet. So we're asking the culture question. It must have something central about culture, the culture questions we've been introducing today. Hamlet. You're welcome to look at films. They're interesting. The range, they vary so much. But we're looking at the text, the thing.
Oh, I just said The Lion King.
The Lion King, is that a play on Hamlet? Is that a...
Yep.
I don't know. I sort of half know The Lion King. Well, that'd be interesting. Midrashes or redoings of Hamlet. Then you can think of them for next week too. The Lion King, we've got our first one. Are often helpful in trying to interpret. Is that Oedipus complex, the Lion King? Is he trying to kill his father and marry his mother?
Lion King was Macbeth.
Pardon?
Oh, is it Macbeth?
It's Macbeth.
No, it's Hamlet.
And then the second Lion King was Romeo.
Second Lion King is Romeo and Juliet. That's what I thought. His uncle kills his brother to take the throne.
Hamlet.
I think there's a couple. There's like what I'm forgetting their names now. Timon and Pumbaa are the comedic. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern.
Okay, so we've got reworking of Hamlet in the 20th century. Lion King. That's next week. Any questions on Hamlet next week? No, not on Hamlet. Got 2 essays, shorter and a longer. You've got dates when the topics will be given out and note when the essays are due. We'll talk more about them when we get closer. These sessions are being recorded on LMS for those of you who are not here, but I doubt whether it's going to be very satisfactory just because of the nature of seminar group discussion. That I doubt whether that's going to pick up a lot, or I'm assuming very frustrating to rely on the recording of these sessions. Any questions on the course before we go back to Socrates?
Yes, I'm wondering if you're trying to create mystery by not giving us any more information on the essays.
No, not at all. I'm being very caring. I'm not getting you tea, don't worry. So postponing your worry and anxiety.
Double-edged sword?
Pardon?
Double-edged sword?
No, they're very caring.
No external reading is a bit of a shock, or not much external reading. It's kind of a
This course is here and now with our texts in this room. And then at home thinking, reflecting. And usually if you're worried and you're doubtful, it's if something's going on inside in the unconscious, and you just sit with it rather than taking to drink or whatever else you do. It may give forth great fruit.
Will you be much of a disadvantage to not attend the voluntary tutorials?
No, I don't think so. No, the content of this course is here in this Monday mornings.
Are you recording the lectures? Or?
Yes, they are. As I said, they are being recorded. But they're not, because it's a seminar more than lectures, I don't think it's going to be very satisfying. It's not going to be like listening to a lecture, because of a lot of your comments and discussion I don't think are going to be picked up on that. So you probably get more irritated than rewarded by relying on. This is live. This course is live seminar, Socratic method. Okay, the Crito. I put up the actual Greek, so pronunciation, Kriton, actually the Greek would have been something like Kriton, the long O. It sort of starts with a dream, Socrates' dream. Can you remember Socrates' dream? Someone who's so rational, he actually takes his dreams very seriously.
Like Freud.
Like Freud, yes, that's true. Freud's more respectful of the unconscious than Socrates. This Socrates, anyway. But yes, like Freud, very rational too. Dream, content of the dream, blurred memory.
Somebody comes to him and tells him he's going to die on the 3rd day.
He's going to die.
Yeah, a beautiful, shapely woman in white robes came and addressed me by name with these words: Socrates, to the fertile lands of
Fifth year.
On the third day shall you come.
He has a dream the night before. In the third pleasant land of Phthia, on the third day you shall come, thou shalt come. Association.
Achilles
Yes, Achilles.
returns to his homeland in Phthia.
Yeah. Achilles comes from Phthia. It's an island, a Greek island.
And I think there's a quote in the Iliad
Yes.
by Achilles.
Good. Halfway through the Iliad, when Achilles hasn't entered the battle, he's in a huff. He's been mistreated by the king, the Greek king. He threatens to go home without fighting, which would be a disaster for the Greeks, because basically they'll lose their best warrior by far. And the voyage will take 3 days. So it's Achilles threatening to go home to Phthia. So it's a reference to Achilles. Socrates seems to think it means he's going to die in 3 days' time. It's a sort of rational interpretation, particularly uninsightful one, I think. The more interesting association is why Achilles? Socrates is... Phthia's got nothing to do with Socrates' biography. He's a citizen of Athens. He's lived in Athens all these 70 years, apart from brief times away fighting. He loves Athens. Why is home going home to Phthia? What any associate? And it's a dream. We'll follow Freud that dreams are some dreams are very significant. This dialogue basically almost starts with this dream, so Plato's taking it as significant. How would you read it? These Freudian readers of dreams, what do you?
I would take it as like him going home is the whole soul being set free thing. So that's why he thinks it's death, because I feel like he feels somewhat constrained by not knowing what comes after life, and I suppose being set free by death will take him home and set him free.
But why is Phthia his home then? What's going on there? That's the puzzling thing. Why not home to Hades or Athens, perfect Athens?
Maybe he sees Achilles as being a coward or not wanting to keep up the fight by returning to Phthia.
Maybe, although it seems as though it was a beautiful woman dressed in white. It seems a sort of positive association going on. He's sort of seeing himself as Achilles in the dream, isn't he? Identifying with Achilles. This is not me, Socrates. Somehow in his dream he's Achilles. Achilles is very different. I mean, this is culture association here. Achilles is the hero. He's not at all Socrates.
But does Socrates view his stance as something somewhat heroic, that he's being loyal to his truth and that he's prepared to die?
But then why, when Achilles is in a way punished for being such an immoral and creating such evil, I mean, you almost couldn't find a more opposite character to Socrates here. It's almost as if Socrates unconscious is saying, wait a minute, Socrates, you might be wrong about yourself as philosopher and how you've led your life. Maybe the person you really wanted to be all your life is Achilles, who's the hero, and whose attributes are excellence and glory and brilliance, not goodness. The hero is excellent, glorious, brilliant, and dies a tragic death.
Right. But Achilles doesn't go home.
No, he doesn't.
Whereas,
in the end, Socrates does, because
right.
Socrates is in Athens.
So he sees himself as the hero, and in his mind, Achilles should have gone home.
Except the tragic hero doesn't get a homecoming. This goes further. Yes, exactly. You can read it. I, Socrates, actually, in my deepest heart of hearts, unconscious, really wanted to be the hero. And an aspect of being the hero is you die young. Achilles dies when he's 25, 30. He doesn't go home, so he doesn't get a homecoming, which is very important to the Greeks. part of Greek culture is very much the good life requires a sort of homecoming, whatever that means. Big question in classical Greek culture, what does a homecoming mean? And Socrates' dream is all about what would, I mean, we're back to the release, as you're pointing out, release from this life. What would a homecoming look like? But wait a minute, what's Socrates doing identifying with Achilles here? I mean, it's we end up in classical Greek culture with almost two models of the ideal human being. There's Achilles the hero and there's Socrates the good man. And they're sort of way apart. And then here we've got Socrates at the start of Kriton, whatever you want to call it. What looks like identifying with Achilles.
Is the lady representing Athena who's judging?
Maybe.
Judging Socrates?
Maybe. The beautiful young woman in white could be an Athena association. It could be a shade of the death figure welcoming him ushering him home. I mean, we do sort of want to find peace or home or something, don't we, when we die, or life completion. I mean, this framework we have affinities with this sort of framework. Socrates also there's another dream that he has through his life that he admits to in one of the other dialogues, which is, anyone of you know it? Someone's constantly telling him throughout his life. Nietzsche uses it 2 weeks' time. Nietzsche will use this against Socrates. Practice music. Throughout his life he's had this dream, practice music, Socrates. Socrates has always assumed that meant philosophy was his music. And so practicing music for him was philosophizing. But approaching death, he starts to worry maybe that wasn't the truth, and he starts writing songs. So thinking maybe he should practice music in the sense of writing songs. The suggestion is his songs aren't very good, and that's not what he's good at. He's not a good songwriter.
So is that sort of symbolic of where he's at in the days leading up to death, where he's really actually questioning?
Well, it seems like he's unconscious, he's questioning. Actually, Socrates, did you choose the right vocation? Maybe actually you should have been the hero, not the philosopher. Anyway, this will come back to us in our future gatherings here. There's this sort of tension going on. It was in the searches between Ethan and Martin. There's this tension going on. Freud admits that he was religiously unmusical. So actually, if we're making the link to Freud in some ways is the great 20th century Socrates. I mean, the examining all the time. I'm religiously unmusical. There's a sense of being musical in Freud's mind too.
Is Socrates perhaps afraid to die, and as such is questioning his right to be a philosopher, because
maybe
he does believe that being a philosopher means welcoming death, and by fearing death, he is questioning his vocation.
And maybe I lived the wrong life.
Yeah.
In retrospect, yes.
Because
I think the implication is, or it may be, he suddenly got worries that actually I've lived the wrong life, and so he's questioning right to the end. I mean, in a sense, this is the ignorant Socrates. We could see this as a virtue. Right to the end, he's not sure, not completely sure. It's very modern. Usually, we're not completely. We might believe things pretty strongly or have strong connections and commitments, but we're not. In your heart of hearts, you believe the soul or something like that lives on after you die, but I suspect that not many modern people could say categorically, I'm absolutely sure that that's the case.
And there is a difference in the way he presents his arguments, at least in the text, between the Apology and Crito, where he's so much more righteous of his position, whereas in Crito, when he's explaining why he won't run away, there is almost like he's not clinging, that's the wrong word, but reassuring himself that his position is right.
So the tone's a bit different.
Yeah, I found that.
I think probably right about that.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to his argument, easier to discuss, for not fleeing. What does it come down to? Not going into exile.
Yeah, he makes a key comment, why should we pay so much attention to what most people think? You know, that's his starting argument, like, you know, when Credo says, why most people think, you know, that most people never believe that it was you who refused to leave this place and we tried to persuade you. He's like, why do we hear what they think? You know, it's what I think is important. And so that's also true today. It's like, you know, why do we pay attention to what everyone else thinks, not what we think ourselves?
Yeah, and his friends are all saying, shock, horror, don't die, stay alive, please stay alive, whatever it takes. I mean, it's a standard response today as always. But his answer for the main argument for staying in Athens and not going into exile, he can easily go into exile. It won't be any problem.
I can't stuck in exile. He says,
there are a few arguments actually, but the main one in the Creto.
If you're a member of society living under the protection of the state's laws within it, and it's provided you with the marriage of your parents and education at all stages of your life, then you have a loyalty to that state. That you, by living in this society, pledge that allegiance, and even if those adjudicating the laws under this, in the name of the state, if they're doing something wrong, which he believes they are, it still doesn't justify you betraying that state and that system that you have pledged allegiance by living in this society.
And especially, I think, in that he had pledged allegiance for so long that he's had the opportunity at many times, at any given time he could have departed, but he's always chosen to stay. So to suddenly give up now just because he didn't like the outcome would be a contradiction.
Yeah, or worse than a contradiction. He has an obligation. There's a sort of, and well, put yourself in this position. I mean, he's right, isn't it? You have a sort of contract. As a society is, the fact you've been born into a society, the society's let you be born into it. It's provided you with parents. It's provided you with an education. It's protected you from invasion. It's provided economic circumstances where you're, reasonable livelihood and comfortably well off. Provided you with university and whatever else. And I mean, at that point, don't you have obligations to the society? I mean, we often don't reflect in these terms, but Socrates is at the point close to death where he's reflecting on, well, I owe Athens a lot. I love Athens. I always have. I've never left it. I could have left it.
He's like Ethan. He took a single oath, and he wants to die by that oath.
Mm-hmm.
He refuses to change his, oath.
Yeah, but he's also saying that by implication, almost everyone who stays in the society in which they're born, grow up, looked after, and so on, you actually, whether you like it or not, whether you acknowledge it or not, you have an oath. You have an obligation to the society that's given so much to you. So if the society one day does something that you don't particularly like, goes off to fight a war you don't believe in, who are you to challenge that?
It's interesting though, like in terms, it made me think of in this day and age, people will be more likely to flee, even with that allegiance, to flee and try and still contribute to their society, to try, like political refugees whose life is in danger. They might flee to another country and still try and contribute to the society that they believe in, but save their lives in the process.
Maybe, in those cases, possible.
And he didn't see that as an option.
Political philosophers like John Locke argued the social contract is the complete opposite, that the state's there to protect you and you live under its protection, but as soon as the state betrays that protection of you, then the social contract is necessary.
Is void. Yeah, okay.
Socrates is saying that that's never voided. It's not the case.
All right, that's a good counter view. Who's right? What do you feel? Do you feel obligations? Maybe you don't, but maybe I should. Maybe I should feel obligations.
Socrates kind of touches a little bit ahead of its time on the categorical imperative, like that you should do what's right regardless of, what could be convenient, because it's right. And if everybody let something slide here and let something slide there, then the whole world would
disintegrate.
Right.
There'd be chaos, anarchy. Yeah. It's a sort of Kant, German philosopher, categorical imperative ahead of.
I disagree. I probably disagree. No, because I see Socrates here as, I think that's all too Cartesian, all too Kantian, obviously. This idea of having this subject that just sort of comes out of nothing and is just formed. I'm not sure if I get that from reading Socrates in the Crito. I think what I see is this idea that the subject is only formed by emerging out of the society and the culture that it exists in, right?
So the society makes the individual in a more profound sense than the argument so far allowed.
So to talk of a Kantian imperative is to talk of this lone ego that has no relationship to anything else, like this ego floating in the ether that has things coming from some transcendental realm saying you must do X, Y, Z. Whereas I think what I see in Socrates here is this utter resignation to the very culture that forms him. This, not just I should not leave, but I cannot leave. The tradition is in him. The culture is in him as much as he is in Athens.
Good. That's a strong argument, isn't it? And he loves, the fact he loves Athens is that, I can't imagine living without the Parthenon there and these streets and those squares and the people I know and the language and the slang and, the taverns and...
Does anyone feel that way anymore,
Anymore?
Yeah, does anyone feel that way? I mean...
Well, people who go overseas often get lonely and nostalgic, don't they? Love to meet other Australians who they have nothing to do with under normal circumstances.
But I think the sense of an oath, though.
The sense of an oath.
I feel...
It often only comes up in times of national crisis, where there's threat, when it does become an issue. What do I believe in? We're in very peaceful times, so none of you are going to, or none of us are going to be confronted. Very unlikely with this question.
Socrates has this feeling of being generated, like Matt said, from this cultural system. He's almost submissive to it. Like it supersedes his importance as an individual. And I was interested, like the translator, I'd never read this, but the editor seems to find the Crito analogous, like an anomaly within Socrates. Like he was saying this is highly controversial. This may not even be Plato, or this was the editor justifying.
He doesn't like it.
He doesn't like it. Well, he doesn't. He thinks it opens the way to political authoritarianism, a submissive sort of populace. And he says it sort of contradicts Socrates' previous oath to the duty to live a philosophical life, his duty to God as a philosopher.
It's consistent with the Republic.
It's consistent with the Republic. I think the other thing is, this would probably go way off topic, but I think that's also a failure to read Kierkegaard. Because this, you could...
Socrates hadn't read Kierkegaard.
I know. But I think the answer is controversial.
The editor.
I think there's an element here where you could read Socrates as sort of the movement from resignation to faith in that sort of fear and trembling sense. But that's probably way off topic.
I also wondered, he's 70. He obviously feels like he's discovered a lot about this life and what it means and all that. And particularly in apology, there was a sense of, I've done my life's work and death is the next step.
Yeah, and I'm too old to change my ways.
Yeah.
I'm too old to...
So I did wonder whether, if this was happening, say when he was a 20 or 30-year-old, whether his position would be quite as strong.
But we've got an objective argument here about our obligations as citizens to the society which has brought us up. And his friends obviously say, no, go into exile. I think he's got a point. He's got a point, doesn't he?
Well, he would be breaking the law if he did anything else.
But he can get away with it. They'll sneak him out. He can, and this particular law he doesn't agree with anyway. So.
And part of their argument was that he still has more to offer, that people are learning from him.
In death.
No, in life.
Oh, in exile.
To flee, part of their argument to exile.
But he says his reputation would be
damaged.
Damaged.
Yeah.
And he'd lose his influence, and that's a separate argument, but probably true too, isn't it?
I think they are connected because his idea seems to be when Chrysos says to him, look, you can get away, you've got more to offer, there's people in Thessaly who will listen to you, blah, blah, blah. He repudiates that by saying that, but I, Socrates, who would go there, would not be the real Socrates. That's essentially what he says. I would not have the integrity, I would not have the conviction, I would not have that consistency, which would make me who I am and make me the sort of the person you want to save.
Yeah. That would not be the Athenian Socrates.
To save me would be to kill me.
Yes. So the two are, I think it's a strong argument, isn't it? The two are linked.
It's a really dangerous position to take. It places way too much trust in the state, and
but I don't think
I just think it's borderline insanity.
But I think it's about culture, not state. Because I think there's a whole. I mean,
but he's placing his trust in the state, in the laws, even though he thinks they're being adjudicated unjustly.
But he disagrees. He openly disagrees with that particular law as it's been put. So he's not acceding to that. He's saying there's a bigger argument here. There's more going on here.
He can't deny them. He can't say that he's happy to fall on those laws, even though he thinks they're unjust. So that's just placing ultimate faith in the state that
but I don't think that's what motivates him. I think that's the crucial part for Socrates. That while he submits himself and resigns himself to the edicts of the law, that's not what motivates him. That's what we're talking about in the apology. What motivates him isn't about following the law, but about doing what is just, which is something that's higher than and separate from the law. I think the complication is a little bit more complex, maybe.
One of my reflections was in that sort of human experience of reading it, going, just live, was that his work has persevered. Like, we're still here talking about it, and would it have persevered without that? What he obviously felt was an integrity towards what he believed in. So maybe he was right in that way, that what he had to contribute, he had to stay true to his views for it to be able to be lasting.
Maybe yes, maybe no.
Yeah.
That's hard to know. I mean, again, the Christian tradition's got its own sense of absolute morality and the reasons for obeying absolute morality. Then they're partly separate from Socrates, but they're only, it's true, there is an influence. I mean, the fact he's a martyr makes a huge difference too. I mean, for some reason, we take martyrs a lot more seriously than Jesus and Socrates are both martyrs. Abraham Lincoln was a sort of martyr.
Looking at the entire book, I haven't read, I think it's called Plato, but I've read up to the end of Plato. It's called Last Days, and if he had gone to exile, this whole book would have been something else entirely, even if it was written at the same time by Plato. With how much he reveres Socrates, it would be a different piece. I don't know if we're still talking about it. It would be something else.
We probably wouldn't, no.
Could he have faked his death to the same effect?
Could he
have faked his death to the same effect? I mean,
well,
because
that's
he
not
says
the story.
that to go into exile would be the same as killing him.
Yes, but I think Matt's right about that in the way that the authentic, be true to, know thyself, be true to yourself. He would be really disobeying that the oracle in Delphi. Have any of you been to Delphi, by the way? No, if you go to Greece, a very powerful place. It's got one of those strange places with great force. There's an oracle there that worked for 400 or 500 years. Even longer. The Greeks and actually a lot of other people took very seriously. Even Socrates, he takes the Delphic oracle seriously.